Okay, good afternoon everybody. Welcome to this latest Post-Brexit Clinic that we're running as part of the Post-Brexit Governance NI project here at Queen's. You're very welcome. I'm David Phinnemore and chairing this, although I'm only chairing one other person, my colleague Professor Katy Hayward. As with other post-Brexit clinics, the purpose of the event is really sort of go through some of the developments around the protocol, Windsor Framework. What we're wanting to focus on very much today is the report that we published this morning on the latest attitudes of Northern Ireland voters towards Brexit, the protocol, the Windsor Framework, and we're going to spend most of the time going through that. As ever, we're really interested to know what questions you have, so please do use the live chat function on your screens, and we'll try and pick up on as many questions as we can during the course of the hour and a quarter we've got with you. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is I'm going to start by saying just a few words around what's been happening with the Windsor Framework since its adoption back in February, and that'll provide a bit of context for the polling that we did, which took place last month. And as I said, we published the report today. And then what we're going to then do is move to Katy. She's going to take us through the bulk of the findings. I'll come in on a couple of points, I think, and then we'll open everything up to questions. Okay. So, in terms of where we are with the protocol Windsor Framework, it was concluded back in February, where you see there on the top left, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, met and essentially signed off on a deal which officials have been working on for quite some time. The key result, I think, for the UK as a whole with the Windsor Framework was essentially it allowed sort of a reset in UK-EU relations. That seemed to be one of the key priorities of the Prime Minister of the UK government in securing the Windsor Framework. And we've seen that sort of play out in part through the UK's participation in Horizon, some other forms of cooperation developing. Although I think there might be a number of people who would say, okay, that reset has not necessarily resulted in as much in terms of further cooperation between the UK and the EU than was possibly envisaged. Okay. More specifically on the Windsor Framework itself, what we see is the UK government over the last 6-9 months really seems to focus on implementation and move away from sort of the contestation with the EU over what the protocol should be doing and indeed some of the consequences of it. And placing this real focus on trying to sort of normalise relations and get into a position of implementation and trying to remove the protocol Windsor Framework from being a contentious issue within the UK relationship. As a consequence, the message it's been putting to within the UK is very much there's no scope now for renegotiation, and the UK government is not going to be pursuing a renegotiation of the terms. Essentially, the focus has been on implementation. That implementation we've seen through a variety of processes, notably, I think, sort of the revival of the institutional framework, which is supposed to be implementing the protocol Windsor Framework. So we've seen meetings of the UK-EU Joint Committee, the Specialised Committee on Implementation of the Windsor Framework. We've seen various other bodies sort of meeting and essentially moves towards delivering on things like the stakeholder engagement, which was such a prominent part of the Windsor Framework when it was agreed back in February. What we've also seen is both the UK and the EU adopt joint decisions implementing the aspects of the Windsor Framework as well as their own domestic decisions and pieces of legislation. And there's been a slew of those coming through the UK Parliament, for example, implementing key features of the Windsor Framework. A lot of that legislation is focused on preparing the so-called Green Lane, which facilitates the movement of certain goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. And then gradually the implementation of that Green Lane so that it could go live on the 1st of October this year. I think one of the key features of the last 6-9 months has been very much the people coming to terms with the question of how green the Green Lane is, that actually the extent of what was being said back in February in terms of the movement of goods and how free they would be or frictionless that would be probably hasn't necessarily materialised to the extent that some people thought it would. Checks, controls, formalities are still required on a good number of goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and we're still to see essentially how that green lane will unfold. The initial assessment is that when the first phase went live on the 1st of October this year, the operation proceeded relatively smoothly. That's at least the view put out by the UK government. And it does seem to be reflected in sort of slightly less contestation around the arrangements than one might have necessarily anticipated when the reality of what the green lane might involve really came to the fore. Okay. What's really missing, though, in terms of the big picture here, is that there's been no return of devolved government in Northern Ireland. If you remember, one of the key purposes of the Windsor Framework was to try and address essentially unionist concerns about what the protocol meant for Northern Ireland, its place in the UK internal market, etc., such that the DUP would agree to return to the executive and, we'd say, restoration of Parliament and devolved government in Northern Ireland. That has yet to occur. And I think we're all sort of following things fairly closely to see what we can pick up from the various statements which are being made as to whether we will see a return at some point in the foreseeable future. We'll have to see. Okay, so that's very much the backdrop to the polling we've done most recently. I'm going to hand over now to Katy, who's going to take us through some of the key findings, and then, as I said, we'll open up to questions afterwards. So, Katy, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, David. So this is the 9th Testing the Temperature poll that we've conducted, and we're delighted to say thanks to all those enthusiasts for the protocol for and against, we continue to have a very high response rate, for which we're grateful. So the weighted sample that we're working on today is just over 1,100. The poll was taken a few weeks after the implementation of the green lane for the first time, so on the 1st of October that happened. We took it 3 weeks later, on the 20th to the 23rd of October. Now, those of you familiar with our post-Brexit clinics will be familiar with the questions that we ask consistently, and then we've asked some new ones as well, so some of this will be familiar to you. What it means to ask these questions consistently is that we're able to assess the degree of change over time. And one thing that we've noticed for several polls now is that there's very little movement on these core questions. So those red lines there across those bars indicate what the result was for the green results, so those who agree or strongly agree together, what the results were in our previous poll in June compared to now. So you can see there's been very little movement really. So people saying Brexit's on balance a good thing for the UK, 60% disagree with that. Clear majority saying that particular arrangements are necessary for Northern Ireland arising out of Brexit. That's 70%, slightly down on last time. Those saying that the protocol with the Windsor Framework is on balance a good thing for Northern Ireland. That's exactly the same as it was last time at 56%. With the Windsor Framework, the protocol provides appropriate means for managing the effects of Brexit on Northern Ireland. That's 58%, slightly down on last time. Reliable information on the protocol and Windsor Framework is available. Only 54% think that, despite our efforts on the Post-Brexit Governance website. And a clear majority of people, 74% at least of our respondents here, think that they have a good understanding of the protocol. One thing you'll note too is not just that we don't have major shifts in terms of those agreeing with these points, but also those disagreeing. So we see consistently around a third of people of the view that the Windsor Framework is not on balance good for Northern Ireland and doesn't provide appropriate means for managing the effects of Brexit in Northern Ireland. So to look in that question in particular, whether the protocol with Windsor is on balance good, this is a time series analysis of the answers given to that question since we first asked it back in March 2021. And if you recall back then, the opinions were very evenly split around whether the protocol was on balance good for Northern Ireland. We saw a change towards the end of 2021 on views on that. So moves then towards just the very slight majority in Northern Ireland, of our respondents thinking that it was on balance good, and we sort of assessed that at the time as being in part because people were looking across the water and seeing the negative impacts of Brexit at the time then in GB. And that pattern remained fairly consistent until after the Windsor Framework. So from spring 23, we saw a move in which there's been a decline, not radical, but notable, from over 40% down to around 35% of people thinking that the protocol with the Windsor Framework is on balance bad for Northern Ireland. And yes, around that 56%, so a slight, an increase in that majority thinking that it's on balance good for Northern Ireland. So that pattern there we've seen for a couple of polls now post-Windsor Framework, so you can see the difference that it has made. We're going to do some breakdowns by affiliation here that might be of interest to you. Because there's only two of us, we can spend more time on this particular topic. So looking by political affiliation, so these are how people self-describe themselves: strong unionist or slight unionist, neutral on the matter, slight nationalist or strong nationalist. And there's a very clear division here. So strong unionists, a clear majority thinking that the protocol is not on balance good for Northern Ireland, and those who are neutral or nationalist of various shades thinking that it is, a clear majority thinking that it is. Amongst slight unionists, we see a split there, and this is something that we've consistently seen across the polls, is that those who are softer unionists are of differing opinions around the protocol Windsor Framework, with more undecideds as well. On the perceived impact of the protocol, again, these are familiar questions that we've been asking for some time. And you can see by those red lines that we've added there how little shift there has been. So in terms of ensuring no diminution of individual rights as protected by the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, the protection of the Belfast Agreement by the Windsor Framework Protocol and North-South cooperation, all of those answers are pretty much consistent, with a majority thinking that it's having a positive impact. Where a negative impact is seen by the majority of people, you can see it's particularly in relation to political stability in Northern Ireland, and that's where we've seen a decline in people think it's having a positive impact over the last 3 months or so, and that's possibly not surprising given, as David mentioned, the lack of assembly and executive. We see a majority thinking that it has a positive impact on the economy of Northern Ireland. And then in relation to Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market and its constitutional place in the UK, we see only a minority think that it has a positive impact. The general view there is either undecided or that it's having a negative impact. We see, interestingly, there's been a slight decline since our previous poll in June as to whether the protocol with the Windsor Framework has a positive impact on British, Irish and UK-EU relations, particular decline of British-Irish relations there. But that's the only major shift we've seen in those questions. This is comparing, this is a slightly more complicated graph here, but we are looking at, so the yellow bars there relate to the poll that we did before the Windsor Framework in spring earlier this year. And then the two blue ones relate to post-Windsor Framework. So then we can measure to see where there's been change. So you can see the drop there in the view that it has a positive impact on British-Irish relations, the slight decline on UK-EU. But relatively speaking, there's been consistency. And pretty much across the board, we see there is a significant improvement in views about it having a positive impact post-Windsor Framework compared to what the protocol was before the Windsor Framework. Now these are, I've used the same colours, but these are the different questions to ones we've asked in other polls. So just to go through them one by one. So the instalment break provides MLAs with a welcome opportunity to exercise democratic controls over changes and updates to EU law applicable in Northern Ireland. That was the tightest we could make that question. So we do provide a little explainer of what this instalment break is when we ask these questions. We can see, notably, a significant number of people are undecided on the matter, and they are quite evenly split too, with 36% disagreeing and 38% agreeing. With respect to the question on UK-EU engagement, should mean fewer difficulties in implementing the protocol. We see a majority thinking that's the case. Those thinking the Windsor Framework is the best available compromise for addressing the concerns of people in Northern Ireland, a clear majority think that's true. However, again, you see across the line there, like the third of people thinking it's not. On the economic opportunities that could benefit Northern Ireland, again, a majority think that's the case. Now we have the Windsor Framework, the Assembly and Executive should be restored and fully functioning. We see 64% of people thinking that's the case, and notably of that, 58% of people are strongly of that opinion, and that's, I think, significant. And then on the questions of some intentions behind the Windsor Framework Protocol, leading to the maintenance of necessary conditions for North-South cooperation, we see a slight majority thinking that's the case, and on whether the UK government is delivering its obligations to ensure no diminution of rights under the agreement, we see actually on that one a majority of people thinking that it is not. To break these ones down, on the stormont break, we know that the stormont break was put in there as an enhancement to the role of the Assembly vis-à-vis the protocol Windsor Framework, and in particular it was put in there in response to some unionist concerns, but we see that strong unionists are not convinced that the stormont break does give them an opportunity as MLAs to exercise democratic control. Notably there we see those who are slightly unionists evenly split on the matter, like a third agree, a third disagree, and a third are undecided. And then a consistent pattern there, those who are neutral and nationalists, a slight majority are of the view that it does give them that opportunity. And then, possibly no surprises here, with the Windsor Framework, the Executive and Assembly should be fully functioning. Strong majority across neutrals and nationalists saying that it should be. A slight majority of slight unionists think that it should be, but notably 37% disagree with that. And then strong unionists, almost 9 in 10, say that it shouldn't be fully functioning with the Windsor Framework, which would be, as you've seen in earlier polls this week, reassuring to the DUP. We asked questions this time that we hadn't asked before about the impact of the Windsor Framework, and this is just for your amusement. We decided to throw a picture in there from a well-known supermarket, in which we see that not for EU labelling, a condition of the Windsor Framework, being used on a supermarket shelf. So even though those goods are made in the European Union, the labelling, which is probably misplaced, is saying that it shouldn't be, it's not for the EU consumption. So on these, it sort of shows that the impact of the Windsor Framework is not particularly having a radical effect in terms of public opinion. So the first question we asked was about GB-produced meat and dairy products, whether they're still available in grocery stores that people usually use, and we see most people saying that they are still available, although a quarter undecided. And then on that not for EU labelling, we see a quarter undecided, but a slight majority of people saying that it doesn't bother them, and a minority, again a quarter, saying that it does bother them. So breaking that down, you can see again that pattern of the difference between neutrals and nationalists, and then unionists, particularly strong unionists. So 2/3 strong unionists saying that the GB-produced products are no longer available. Again, slight unionists are evenly split on the subject, and then those who are neutral nationalists say that they are available. And then on the EU labelling, again, that pattern, most, including most slightly unionists, say that it doesn't bother them, and then the plurality of strong unionists saying that it does. And then onto the bigger picture. So these are new questions again. So Brexit has led to the centralisation of power in Westminster at the expense of devolution. A majority of people say that's the case. We see a majority of people thinking that the UK government in future shouldn't rule out the option of rejoining the EU, although just under a third of people say that it should. A clear majority of people, 81%, don't think that Brexit's delivering on the benefits envisaged by Leave in 2016. A clear majority of people would not vote differently if the referendum was to happen again. They don't think they think they voted the right way. We asked a question that relates to the Northern Ireland Life and Times questions as well, on whether Brexit makes United Ireland more likely, and just as in Life and Times, saying that a clear majority think that's the case, similarly to we see that here at 58%. And then on whether the UK and EU should pursue closer relations under the TCA, we see a clear majority thinking they should. Only a minority of 17% say they shouldn't. People are quite strongly of the view that they should do that. So just a breakdown of a couple of those questions before I hand over to David to talk about the results on democratic consent. What's interesting is Remainers and Leavers, Unionists and Nationalists alike, do not believe that Brexit's delivering the benefits envisaged by Leave in 2016. And one thing I did to try and compare between our results and maybe similar results in Britain, because we've heard some stuff recently about regret and regretfulness in GB. Do we see that in Northern Ireland? So that's basically where the Leave voters are disappointed. What's quite interesting is looking at this, so you see the Northern Ireland Leave voters, only 15% think that Brexit is delivering the benefits envisaged by Leave, and 20% of GB Leave voters think that Brexit is delivering the benefits envisaged by Leave. In Northern Ireland, 70% of Leave voters think that the benefits envisaged have not been delivered, and this is twice as many as those in GB. Now, it's a slightly different question, so bear that in mind. But that is quite interesting that the Leave voters in Northern Ireland are doubly disappointed, if you like. And that is no doubt feeding into a lot of the positions being taken by largely Leave voters in response to the Protocol Windsor framework. Do you want to talk about trust? I can talk about trust. So these are familiar to you as well. There's a lot of data here, but you know the score. So trust in managing Northern Ireland's interests in relation to the Protocol Windsor framework. Trust in the UK government has gone up from 4% to 7%, equaling its highest ever tally on that. Trust in the Northern Ireland executive remains very low at 15%, the same as our last poll. Trust in the Irish government is more or less where it was last time round at 45%. Trust in the EU is slightly lower than what it was, but not radically so. We see trust in Sinn Féin, the SLP, dropping slightly from our previous poll. Trust in Alliance is maintaining its position more or less. Slight drop in trust in the UUP, and steady as she goes to the DUP and TUV in terms of levels of trust. One thing that continues to grow, it seems, is trust in Northern Ireland business representatives. So 6 out of 10 people say that they trust them to manage Northern Ireland's interests in relation to the protocol, and they clearly trust him more than any other actor in that regard. Trust in the Northern Ireland civil service is at 35%. Now on to the democratic consent vote.
Okay, thanks, Katy. One of the key provisions of the Protocol Windsor framework is Article 18 on democratic consent. And this is the mechanism which allows members of the Northern Ireland Assembly to vote potentially every 4 years on whether to continue core aspects of the Protocol Windsor framework, essentially those that govern the movement of goods and electricity on the island of Ireland. And basically, the arrangements are set up such that there will probably be a vote, irrespective of whether we have the Assembly in place or not, in November, December next year. If the MLAs vote in favour of democratic consent, then the provisions around the movement of goods continue. If they vote by a simple majority, they will continue for 4 years. If they vote using it on a cross-community consent basis, then the next vote will be scheduled for 8 years after then. Okay. If they don't grant democratic consent, and a motion is put to them and they don't grant democratic consent, then essentially the arrangements in the protocol in Articles 5 to 10 will fall after 2 years. And essentially it will be up to the UK and the EU to try and find a set of arrangements on which they would agree and implement those within the 2 years. If they don't agree within the 2 years, then Northern Ireland, in terms of trade with the EU, would revert to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In short, that would essentially mean that on the land border here, the arrangements would be as they would be for the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, say from Dover to Calais. Okay, so quite a significant responsibility on MLAs there to decide what they do in 2024. Now, across our polls, we've been asking what people would like to see the MLAs do, grant democratic consent or not. We've also been quite interested in the significance of that vote for how people might vote in a Northern Ireland Assembly election. Okay, so on this particular occasion, so based on the polling in October, this is the result that we have. 56% of voters would like to see MLAs vote in favour of continued application of Articles 5 to 10. A third, however, would want their MLAs to vote against. Okay, means 90% of people have a view on this issue, which flags the salience of it. There's only 10% who have no interest in how MLAs will vote or have no preference either way. Okay. This, as I said, is a question we've asked across time, and Katy's pulled together a really useful diagram here of what the vote has been at different points. If you start on the left-hand side there, back in March 2021, 5 percentage point difference between those who wanted continued application of the protocol, 47%, and those against, 42%. They then moved to an equal position, 46% in June. But thereafter, and this picks up on a point Katy made earlier about attitudes to whether protocol on balance is a good thing for Northern Ireland, we see a 10 percentage point gap emerging, such that a majority, or a very slender majority, of voters want MLAs to vote in favour of continued application in 2024, but a significant minority, 40%, want the MLAs to vote against continued application. We then get the Windsor Framework in February 23, and we see a quite significant widening of that 10 percentage point gap. It increases from 10 percentage points to 29 percentage points. 61% of people wanting MLAs to vote in favour of continued application, 32% against. What we saw in June, however, most probably on the back of a deeper understanding of what the Windsor Framework was going to mean, was a narrowing of that gap. So we saw those in favour of continued application decreasing from 61% to 58%, and correspondingly those opposed to continued application of Articles 5 to 10 increasing to 36%. The question in our minds this time was whether that was a trend which would continue, or whether it was going to steady, plateau out, or even reverse. What we see this time, though, is essentially the same percentage point gap existing. We've got a 22 percentage point gap in June. We've got a 22 percentage point gap in October. There's a slight decrease in both constituencies' views there. But essentially, this is, compared to pre-Windsor Framework, a substantial gap now between those who would like to see MLAs vote in favour of continued application of Articles 5 to 10 and those who would prefer them to vote against. Okay. So the second question we've asked consistently here is whether, if there were an election to the Assembly, this time within the next 12 months, how important would people think a candidate's position on the protocol would be for their vote? Okay. What we see here is a slender majority saying that they would either simply vote for candidates who were in favour of continuing the applications of Articles 5 to 10, or they would vote for candidates who support continued application provided there's evidence of the arrangements benefiting Northern Ireland. That totals 52%. Okay. Now that's obviously short of some of the figures we saw earlier about whether people think on balance the protocol is good or not for Northern Ireland, which are around 56, 58%. Now part of that gap is probably explained by the fact that 16% of people do not think that the protocol Windsor framework would determine whether, or candidates' position on the protocol Windsor framework would determine whether they vote for them or not. What's significant here is on the left-hand side that we've got 42% of voters indicating that they would only vote for candidates who are opposed to the continued application of the core provisions, Articles 5 to 10 of the protocol. Within that, however, what's noticeable is that whereas 9% would implicitly accept the rest of the protocol, they would not want to see the continued applications of Articles 5 to 10. But almost a quarter of our voters, respondents overall, say that they would only vote for candidates who are in favour of actually scrapping the protocol Windsor framework altogether. I think this very much reflects that sort of the dark blue in many of the previous slides on the right-hand side, where you see quite extensive concerns being raised, opposition being voiced against the protocol and core aspects of it. And very much, I think this reflects a position we've reached where there's quite significant, almost embedded, principled opposition to the protocol Windsor framework, post-Brexit arrangements for Northern Ireland as a whole. And there's no real indication that that is shifting at all. Okay. Final couple of slides focus on some of the qualitative comments that we've picked up in the polling. I think one of the things that, or two things we've been impressed by over time, first, as Katy said, the rate of response. We've really been impressed by the number of people who've continued to engage with this polling. But the second thing is the rate of response in terms of providing additional qualitative comments. It's not a requirement of the poll, but there's a lot of people, around about 20%, who are very keen to offer their views on different aspects of the protocol, Windsor framework, and indeed Brexit as a whole. Okay. Colleague Lisa Whitten, who many of you will know, meticulously goes through, codes all the responses, and you see there essentially a summary of her coding here, where you see most people, if they are providing comments, tend to be looking at the issue of Brexit as a whole, or whether they have a positive or negative view of the protocol. This time what's interesting is that there's quite a significant increase in the people who are commenting directly on the question of Brexit, making the point from their perspective that it's a folly, it's a mess, that is the core problem. Equally, however, we have a significant number of people expressing negative views about the protocol, the Windsor framework, although as a proportion of those providing comments, this is down on previous polls. We have to be really careful here because the data here is unweighted. We cannot determine what people's backgrounds are from the comments and the way the polling is structured. So we have to be very careful. But I think, nevertheless, this coding does give us a sense as to what the key themes are for many of the people who do take part in the polling. Okay. What we see in terms of the nature of these responses, very much in line with what we've seen previously, that where people have a negative view of the protocol Windsor framework, it's either in terms of a negative view as a matter of principle, they oppose the protocol as a matter of principle. Others will actually be expressing negative views because of the effects of the protocol. I think that 14% there, the predominance of views opposing the protocol as a matter of principle, very much reflect that 23% who obviously will only vote in a future Assembly election for candidates who are in favour of scrapping the protocol. Where there are views expressed giving a positive view of the protocol, these are divided. Some indicate that the protocol is very much a least worst option for post-Brexit Northern Ireland. Others will see that the arrangements are either beneficial or potentially beneficial for Northern Ireland. Okay, but at the same time, we're dealing with fairly small numbers here in terms of the proportion of respondents. Views on Brexit, two sets of views here that were coming through in the comments on this occasion. One, the dominant one, was okay, Brexit is the issue here, that Brexit is problematic. Points you see there that some people say self-inflicted damage, and also others will say it proved to be, in their terms, disaster and causing political turmoil. But equally what we see coming through is frustration among some of our respondents that Brexit has actually only been achieved in name only, both generally for the UK but also specifically for Northern Ireland, that actually Northern Ireland has not left the EU to the same extent as the rest of the UK, so we can only refer to essentially Brexit in name only. What also comes through, and this possibly reflects the response rate we saw to the restoration of the Assembly and Executive, is quite a not insignificant number of people commenting with criticism of the DUP, that it's time to essentially get the executive back up and running, and that concessions have been made through the Protocol Windsor framework, going a long way, that equally being a long way down the list of problems which Northern Ireland is facing. But equally, however, what came through in the comments on this occasion was support for the DUP, and that devolution should not be restored until the 7 tests are met. And I think we possibly see this reflected also in that support, particularly amongst strong unionists, for the DUP's position on not entering the executive and the Assembly until its concerns are addressed regarding the protocol and the Windsor framework. Okay. So that's a summary of what we've concluded so far with the data we've had. It's hopefully giving you a bit more of a breakdown than we possibly normally provide in terms of the responses. We're now open to questions, I think, from you. And I see we've got a couple coming through. First off, I think this relates to the Stormont break, and that is whether the Stormont break use needs to await the return of the Assembly. And I think the answer is clearly yes. From a technical perspective, the legislation providing for the operation of the Stormont break, both versions, there's one which looks at the Assembly being able to essentially block the adoption or the implementation of changes and replacements to EU law in Northern Ireland under the protocol. Stress there is on changes and replacements. And there's another one which basically says, okay, if there's going to be a piece of legislation, a new piece of EU legislation added to the protocol, then the UK government will only agree if there is a positive motion coming from MLAs in support of it. Okay, the legislation for that has been agreed, has been approved, but has not been implemented. And so the understanding is that it will only be implemented if and when the Assembly returns. Okay, so that power will only come available if the Assembly is returned. And we'll have to see about that in due course. We've also got a second question here, and I'll hand over to Katy because she's been looking at the data in far more detail than I have. Are there any indications of intergenerational differences in our results?
So the interesting thing is that there doesn't seem to be much of a generational difference. So across pretty much all of the questions, it's difficult to say that younger people tend to feel, say, more pro-protocol than older people. Now, the problem is when you begin to break it down into generations, you get smaller numbers and then the data becomes that bit less reliable. Interestingly, it doesn't seem to be the 18 to 34-year-olds who may be the sort of the most pro-Remain or pro-protocol or whatever. If there's a consistent pattern, it would be mainly the 35 to 44-year-olds who would be, and the 55 to 64-year-olds tend to be maybe those who are a bit more sceptical about the protocol rather than the older ones. So that's a very slight pattern that we see, but generally across pretty much all of the questions we were asking, there doesn't seem to be a significant generational change, divide. However, the one question where it does seem to be significant is in relation to whether Brexit makes United Ireland more likely. So the older generations of 55s see it as not making United Ireland more likely, or they're less likely to think it makes United Ireland more likely than younger people seem to think it does. So that's very interesting, I think. We also look at the data in terms of class as well, and again, that doesn't seem to be a very significant variable in many of these questions. One where it is significant, where you see sort of middle class is more the divide between sort of ABC1 and C2DE, as they call it, is in relation to future rejoining of the EU. So we see the middle class is much more likely to say that the UK government shouldn't rule out that option than C2DE classes would be saying, which is interesting. And on the democratic consent vote, again, the ABC1 12 percentage points more likely to say that there should be a vote in favour of continuing with Articles 5 to 10 rather than discontinuing. So those are, I think what's interesting about all of this is that class and age are not very significant variables. Gender is in some cases, and we tend to highlight that, but that's generally the case, that it's not as significant as you might think it'd be.
Okay, if people have more questions, then please do put them into the chat. I've got a couple here for Katy. I've not primed her with them either. I'm just thinking, what we see in this polling is continued evidence of very strong opposition to the protocol, in principled opposition to it, particularly amongst strongly unionists. Some of those figures are at almost 80% levels of concern or opposition to things. Okay, if we were to get a return to the Assembly, which would essentially indicate that the DUP is content with or accepting of the arrangements, what do you think would actually happen to some of that opposition? Should we see a significant drop in that, where voters will essentially follow the leadership? Or do you think that level of opposition would be sustained, thus creating quite an interesting issue problem for the DUP?
So that's obviously a question that they are trying to work out themselves at the moment as well. I mean, one thing I would refer to is our poll, a few polls back, where we asked where people get their information from in respect of this protocol. And we saw, particularly for DUP and Sinn Féin supporters, they were saying that they take their information and lead from their parties that they support. So that would suggest that if the DUP does go back in and is accepting to some degree the existence of the protocol, or there's some way by which it can marry those things, then maybe the opinion of their supporters would shift as well. But of course, the concern for them is that for so long, including over the last few months, the discourse about the Windsor Framework from the DUP has been very negative still. I think there's still areas to be addressed. So how you'd have a turnaround whereby they can go back in and allow, demonstration that some of those areas have been addressed, whilst bringing everybody with them is obviously the key question.
Okay. I suppose looking at the data from a different perspective, what we see is very high levels of support for the Protocol Windsor Framework arrangements, generally amongst people who identify as nationalists, whether it's strongly or slightly, and indeed many people who actually identify as neutral. Do you envisage any significant change in those over time? Because there are occasions where we do see drops, and I think some of the enthusiasm for the Windsor Framework, which we might have seen in June, isn't necessarily as evident now.
Yes, I mean, we know that the protocol, again from other polling, that the protocol is not as big an issue for supporters of other parties than the DUP and TUV. And that means that maybe if it becomes a situation where it's no longer such a contested issue, that then people will begin to vary in their opinions about it. But yes, at the moment, I think, as we said, I think a lot of it is about a position of principle. So we do see people tending to vote consistently in a way if they're saying, I'm demonstrating support for the Protocol Windsor Framework, even if we're maybe asking questions that we thought might be a little bit more nuanced. for example, around the protection of individual rights by the British government. If it's sort of ambiguous as to whether the question is going to allow you to show support for the protocol or not, then there's a little bit of movement, but otherwise I think it does seem to be an issue of principle now rather than anything else.
Okay, we've got another question that's come through, and this is about the level of engagement that there is with those who have sceptical views about the protocol Windsor framework, whether, for example, at community level. Is there engagement, or what are the levels of constructive engagement which we actually see from academia, from community workers in terms of some of these issues that people are concerned about regarding the protocol?
Is it about the issues, or is it about information on the protocol?
I think it's essentially about what levels of constructive engagement do we see?
So I know some community groups are keen to get information and to inform people in order to have like an informed discussion, and people then can make up their own minds about it. And we here in our post-Brexit governance team have been keen to do that and engage, and are doing so in various communities. And if I can give a little plug for an explainer that's on the QPOL website and on the Post-Brexit Governance website, that's meant to try and put these things as simply as possible. That's we can do that. But I think there is a caution about it in some ways, because it is complicated, and there is a danger in sort of oversimplifying down to sound bites. And obviously, when we talk about the Protocol Windsor Framework as being an issue of principle, a lot of that relates to those sound bites. And so, yeah, it also relates to wider questions of whether of community education engagement on other matters of political and economic significance, and how typical it is to have such engagement anyway.
Okay. I see that's the questions exhausted. I'm going to spare you any more from me. So I think that therefore we'll bring this to a close. Thanks to Katy. Thanks for everybody for coming along.
I could ask you a question.
Oh, you can if you want to ask me a question.
To abuse the chair instead of the chair's rights. My question, I think it is interesting though. Could you say a wee bit about, there's a lot of interest about the future UK-EU relationship, and there is a suspicion that maybe people are waiting for maybe a Labour government in which they would have a close relationship with the EU. And then that would magically solve all the Irish sea border issues. Are people wise to wait for that, or right to expect that?
Okay, I think, yes, I think one of the things we see in the polling is that there's a significant, or not insignificant majority who would actually welcome closer UK-EU relations. And when we posed the question, that was very much in the context of easing arrangements for the movement of goods, both generally or across from GB to NI. And I think a lot of the discussion around how do you resolve some of those frictions does point to the need for the UK and the EU to move towards a veterinary agreement or an agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary products, of which there are a number of examples around, ones which the Swiss have with the EU, for example. And certainly the indications have been that a Labour government would be open to that. And I think they have almost on record saying they will pursue something in that area. Two questions arise. How far are they willing to go in terms of what the EU would expect in exchange? And secondly, to what extent is the EU interested in this? And that plugs in more broadly to the question of a wider UK-EU, a more developed wider UK-EU relationship with the EU. It's fair enough the UK wanting to pursue that, or a Labour government, if it were to come about, wanting to pursue that, but it has to bring something to the EU. And I think part of the view in Brussels and amongst the EU member states is, okay, we've signed a deal, we've concluded a deal. Various of these things were available or could have been on offer at the time, but you didn't want them. Okay. Secondly, we've got a lot of other things to address. I think what was striking this year, for those who follow closely issues, developments in Brussels, is when the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, issued her State of the Union address. There was no mention of the UK-EU relationship in it. Now, previous years, it's been in there because of the frictions within the relationship and the difficulties around the protocol. But there's so much more on the EU's agenda now. We've got Ukraine, we've got the Middle East. The EU yesterday talked about making progress in opening more accession negotiations with countries. There's a debate ongoing now about what sort of reforms do you need to bring about to the EU. And there's a whole series of other relationships which the EU has, as well as policy concerns, such that the UK is very much lower down the pecking order in terms of the priorities of the EU. And so you've also got this mismatch of just when the UK is possibly moving to a situation where it may be open to a closer relationship, the level of interest on the EU side is much weaker than it has been. So
it's more likely to be an off-the-shelf option, in which case would the government be willing to pay what's the marked price?
Yes, and I think it goes back to some of the arguments we saw during the time of the negotiation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, whereby the EU is effectively saying, look, you are a major partner of ours in trade terms, so we want as free trade as possible. But if you want the almost frictionless access to the single market, particularly around agricultural goods, you've basically got to sign up to our rules on SPS. And coming with that is essentially jurisdiction of the Court of Justice in terms of their interpretation. Now you think of how that sits with UK government policy at the moment, it would be simply no go. And even I think for a Labour Party, there's significant reservations about that because of the commitments it involves. And that's partly also reflected in Labour's rhetoric around future relationship, where it refuses to countenance the idea of single market or customs union. So yeah, I think there's a nervousness there, which partly reflects also, yes, there's been a shift in public opinion in Great Britain on Brexit, but there's still a very strong level of support for Brexit, including within the Labour Party or amongst Labour supporters.
So you get back to that question of Northern Ireland being treated differently from the rest of the UK and why that is. The sort of that very familiar question that we've been looking at for 7 years.
Yeah, it's been there all along. But there are difficult choices there to be made by UK government. Okay. All right.
Thanks. That was a very good answer. I'm glad I asked the question.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we have actually got another question. Thanks, Katy, for the input. A perception of the EU as it engages with change, like enlargement, instability, that impact these islands matter, and that change is ongoing. So I think sort of partly picks up on what I've just been saying.
Yeah.
Things happen in the EU, and we can't necessarily look at this through the lens of what the UK, what Northern Ireland wants. There's going to be a quid pro quo here. Yeah. What does the EU want? And the EU is going to be affected by many of the changes that it's going through.
That's true.
Not good. Okay, I think we will draw it to a close there. I say thanks ever so much, everybody, for coming along, for your questions, and paying attention to what we've been saying. If you're interested in more, we've got the report, which is quite lengthy, I think about 20 pages long, I think, available on the website. And I think what we do, because we have your contact, we can actually send out a copy or the link to you. We're doing our next set of polling probably in February next year, and we'll certainly be running a clinic on the back of that. And I think it's fair to say if there are any significant developments in and around the Windsor framework, the UK-EU relationship as it relates to Northern Ireland, we may hold another clinic before then. But for the moment, thanks very much for coming along. Hopefully that was useful. And Katy, yes.
Can I just make a little plug? If you're interested in transatlantic relations, there's a conference called Bridging the Atlantic on Monday afternoon here in Queen's in the Council Chamber. It's going to be live streamed as well as in person. Please register via the Mitchell Institute Eventbrite site. It'd be great to see you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.